was probably often met with anger or abandonment or some other unpleasant and terrifying reaction for a child from a caregiver. As a result, they developed hypervigilance. In this environment, it was difficult to know what they needed to do when they needed to do it, because boundaries were on roller skates. Sometimes they were expected to have an opinion. Other times they were punished for having an opinion. They were constantly surveying the caregivers to try to figure out what they needed to do at this time in this context to stay safe. They were like a soldier in a foxhole. They were...
And I think what she brings up here about the hypervigilance, the symptom, is really interesting. And I think this is a good opportunity to reiterate the fact that it's very common with any kind of mental health diagnosis for there to be multiple disorders that overlap with the same types of symptoms. So we've talked on previous streams about hypervigilance as a symptom of many things. So just to remind people, hypervigilance is very common in people that have CPTSD. So we talked about CPTSD probably sometime last week. Chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. And so if you grew up, oftentimes people grew up in traumatic childhoods, and that's why they display the symptoms of CPTSD. And so if you grew up in a household that was dangerous or toxic, hypervigilance is a way to stay safe, is something that you would naturally adopt, right? Same kind of thing happens in codependency as well. And also, for those of you who have been hanging around since we talked about attachment stuff, which it's been a while, we might have to do another swing through the attachment styles at some point in the future. Fearful avoidant attachment, which is one of the 3 insecure attachments that we've talked about before. Fearful avoidant attachment style, or people with that attachment style, also quite often display hypervigilance. And it's funny because all of those different mental health disorders, or I'm not going to call them disorders necessarily because attachment style is not really a disorder, but diagnoses, they all have this common root of instability during childhood with the primary caregivers, right? And so there's this sense of, I don't know whether I'm allowed to have boundaries. I don't know whether I'm safe. I don't know whether my needs will be met. And so I have to just be constantly scanning my environment to be like, oh, is mom or dad a safe place for me right now, or are they not safe? And so for all of these different type of disorders, you see this strong overlap that comes from that common source.
Potentially able to eat, potentially able to sleep, but it wasn't good quality sleep. And they were constantly anxious or fearful or sometimes angry, because remember, anger and fear protect from a threat. So the child may become angry and belligerent as opposed to anxious and passive. That's their way of trying to protect themselves. The way they manifest their perception of threat is based on what is rewarded. The angry and belligerent child, that may be the only way they can get their caregiver's attention, because their caregivers are so disconnected from everything. So it's important to look at your symptoms and say, okay, what in my past caused me to start feeling like I always need to be on guard, like I'm never safe? People pleasing
is a big
goes
big
along
thing.
with what we've talked about. People with codependency are often very strong people pleasers to their detriment. It's not just, I'm going to do nice things for you when I've got energy or time or whatever, but it's, I'm going to do nice things for you to my own expense because I so need you to like me. I so need you to not abandon me. I so need you to not be angry.
And again, the people pleasing goes back to the difficulty setting and maintaining boundaries, right? And so when typically we'd think of someone as a people pleaser, we think of them as a people pleaser. And another word that people probably come to mind is the idea of like a doormat, right? It's because this person is willing to do what someone else wants, even at the expense of their own needs and boundaries, right? And so the people pleasing, yeah, it's a common thing of codependency. It's a common thing of a lot of different disorders, but codependency is like defined by this people pleasing thing, which is ironic. Again, it's people pleasing, but then there's also like this caretaker, sometimes manipulative aspect to it as well. So it's those two key things. It's like this very like passive aggressive style of relating to others. I'm going to do things to people please you, but then I'm also going to kind of slowly, subtly try to like get you to do what I want. So if you're an alcoholic, you know, if I'm in a relationship with an alcoholic, I'm going to let you get drunk and, you know, lose your job and come home and abuse the kids. Sorry, trigger warning. But also I'm going to do things to like subtly try to get you to change at the same time. It's this very like passive aggressive people pleasing thing, which can drive some people nuts. And it's unfortunately can be a very toxic element in the relationship, just as toxic as say the partner who is abusive or an alcoholic or a narcissist or whatever the case may be.
And a lot of times people with codependency have a hard time saying no to things because of their fear of rejection or abandonment, which again, often goes.
Okay, this is another anecdote. Early on into my professional career, I remember really struggling with this. I don't know if anyone out there has ever had the same thing. I don't have this issue anymore, but I remember when was in like some of my first job, like real jobs in my early 20s. And I've worked in healthcare for quite a while. So back then I remember I worked in like the pharmacy for a while. And I'd constantly have like my supervisor texting me, asking me to pick up shifts because someone would call it, because healthcare is just like every position in healthcare is just a constant revolving door because burnout's just such a constant thing in that field. And so we'd always have people that were like calling out or quitting. And so we'd always, you know, the manager would always be reaching out to pick up shifts. And I remember I got to the point where I was just like constantly picking up shifts and I could never say no, or I would say yes. And then on the back end, I would just make up some bullshit excuse why when the day of I couldn't show up, which was awful for them because here they are, you know, it's a couple days beforehand and they're, you know, think that they've got coverage. And then the morning of, I'm like, oh, sorry, I'm sick. I can't come in after all, you know, rather than just being like, no, sorry, I have plans that day.
Goes back to those.
So again, kind of highlights the people pleaser, but then there's this like passive aggressive, like, you know, I still have needs. I still got to try to express them, but I'm just going to do it in a very like over or kind of covert kind of way.
Early relationships. Now, I will say codependency is not something that has to develop in childhood. If somebody is in a dysfunctional relationship as an adult, these behaviors can develop for the very same reasons. But it's important to recognize in you, if you feel like you have some of these symptoms, what caused you to develop them and what function are they serving now? How are they helping you potentially or stay safe? Or how are they trying to help you stay safe? A denial.
And that kind of highlights this idea of, it really goes back to modeling by the primary caregivers. So if your primary caregivers modeled for you healthy boundaries and reinforced like, hey, you may be a child, but you're a little human being and you're going to have wants and needs and boundaries, and that's okay. And I'm an adult and I'm your parent, but you know, it's still okay to say like no to me sometimes or have your own boundaries or whatever. If parents really model healthy boundaries for you, then you grow up and you quite often don't struggle with the codependency. It's when your parents didn't model healthy boundaries for you because they themselves were people pleasers or codependents, or were manipulative and disrespected your boundaries, or, you know, there's abuse going on in the house of whatever type. Quite often, as a result of that, because you were modeled to put your boundaries aside, to put your needs to the side, quite often you become an adult who goes out into relationships in adulthood and models that same dynamic where you're putting your needs aside, putting your boundaries aside in order to please others, right? Because when we're a little kid, if we have to do that in order to avoid being abandoned, we're going to do that. Because when you're like 5 years old, the most important thing to you is to not be abandoned and to be loved by the people around you at all costs, right? When you're an adult and you can survive even if you're on your own, then it becomes maladaptive.
Of personal needs is also very common. If the person was in a relationship where the person with codependency was in a relationship where the dysfunctional other needed to be taken care of, and if they didn't take care of that person, then they would be abandoned. They would be in a bad place.
Exactly.
Then the person with codependency learned to put aside their personal needs because in order to survive, they needed to take care of the dysfunctional other. A fear of abandonment is often covered up by a need to be needed. A lot of times people with codependency are attracted to people who have needs, people who need to be taken care of.
Yeah, and I'd say that dynamic is like the defining thing of codependency. It's this, I have a fear of being abandoned myself, and so what I do is look for people that I can save, because if I'm saving you and you need me, then you can't abandon me, because if you can't survive on your own, then you need me. And if you can't survive without me, then I don't have to worry about being abandoned. Oh, God, that's like such a, at the heart, a key defining feature of codependency.
People who are troubled because if they are needed, then they won't be abandoned. If they are indispensable, then it's less likely the person will abandon them. It doesn't mean they're going to have a great quality of life. The relationship could be really crappy, but if they're needed, then a lot of times that person won't abandon them.
Have been there and gotten the t-shirt from that more times than I'd like to imagine. Thankfully, I've done a lot of work and come a long ways in this sort of thing. But let me tell you, if you are a person that struggles with codependency, you will go into one toxic, dysfunctional relationship after another. Quite often, you'll end up with people that are very flawed, that maybe have significant amount of trauma themselves, or substance abuse issues, anger issues, and just, and I mean, it'll be, there's almost a comfort and a safety in knowing that, like, oh yeah, this person could not survive without me. They need me. But quite often, it's toxic for both people involved, and it's not a fun time, unfortunately. The healthiest thing for both people would be to really focus on healing their own stuff and dealing with their own fears of abandonment, so that they could survive being alone, right? And even if they were to be in a relationship with each other, do so from a healthy place of interdependence, not codependence.
Which takes us to control issues. Growing up or being in a relationship, even if it wasn't as a child, with a dysfunctional other can cause the person with codependency to start developing control issues. If you do what I tell you to do the way I tell you to do it, you'll be fine. I need to watch your every move because I can't trust you to do the next right thing. Children may have learned that by watching their caregiver who was codependent take care of a dysfunctional other, or adults may learn it in dysfunctional relationships as they are trying to care for a dysfunctional other.
Yeah, so I'd say if you think that this issue in particular might be something that you struggle with, I would invite you to look back at your relationship between your parents. And if you weren't raised by your biological parents, then whoever your primary caregivers was. If you were raised alone, then this might be kind of hard. But try to think back if you were raised by your parents or non-biological caregivers. Analyze their relationship. Did one person in the relationship struggle with substance abuse issues, struggle with trauma? Were they abusive? Were they just generally difficult? Maybe you suspected that mom or dad might have been a narcissist and the other parent was the savior or the person that was constantly trying to change them or save them or fix them or manipulate them. Quite often, if you think that you might struggle with codependency, it's because that behavior and that pattern of relating to others was modeled for you by your primary caregivers.
Difficulty expressing emotions or dysregulation is another symptom of codependency. A lot of people who have developed codependent symptoms remember I said they're hypervigilant. They feel unsafe a lot of times, which means their stress response system is always on. And we know when that stress response system stays on too long, it quits functioning as effectively. And without getting into, great explanations for why all that is, it's important to recognize that a lot of times the person with codependency will get to the point where they don't feel a lot most of the time. They feel kind of flat. If they're not feeling anxious or irritable, they're feeling kind of flat. But then when they do get upset, they go from 0 to tsunami like that. And that is the stress response system reacting in overdrive. The stress response system saying, okay, I got to get out of this. Kind of like when you're stuck in the mud. If you push on the gas a little bit, you're probably just going to dig yourself deeper. But if you're somehow able to get traction and you floor it, all of a sudden you get released and you go, tearing out of there. That's kind of what.
And so again, if you think that you may be a person that this might apply to, try to look at the hypervigilance thing. Try to look at, am I constantly in this baseline state of what's called emotional arousal? So I'm constantly anxious, or I'm just constantly keyed up. You're like a car that's always like revved up in, oh god, I don't know shit about cars, but like third gear. You know what I mean? I don't know why I thought of One Piece when I said that, but so if you're someone that's just like has a really hard time just being calm, like constant anxiety is a very common symptom associated with this. But also, sometimes you can have this emotional flatness to you. A lot of times, I personally I don't resonate with this, but I can definitely resonate with the constantly being geared up thing. I think that was a defining part of most of my younger years. Sometimes people with codependency get so used to putting their own needs and boundaries aside that they even get good at repressing their own emotions in order to have more space to caretake for someone else's. So if you're someone that's just like she mentioned, constantly emotionally flat, or someone who's constantly emotionally keyed up, or you bounce between the two, there's like never just a stable. Oh god, I remember I've been in couples therapy before where I'm just like, yeah, I'm just kind of always like, this just always a thing. There's just like this weird stable place just doesn't exist for me. And being able to live in that just normal, peaceful state has been a work for me for many, many years. I feel like I've gotten to it a lot better than I used to be able to. But if you're someone that's a defining thing for you, maybe another symptom that codependency is a good fit for you.
What the stress response system is doing. It recognizes you're constantly under stress, and the dysregulation is a oh crap response. I got to get out of here. Guilt is also very common in people with codependency because the dysfunctional other is often not willing or able to help themselves. And the person with codependency, since they think, well, if I can love you enough, if I can control you enough, if I can, get you on the right path, then you'll be fine.
Oof.
And when that doesn't happen,
sister.
The person with codependency often feels guilt. They feel like it's their responsibility to fix or change the other person. They miss the whole chapter on the fact that you cannot change another person. You can lead them to water. You can't force them to drink, as they say.
Yeah. Ooh, man. Ooh, man. Yeah, I know I personally have been in relationships in the past where I like really, really resonate with that of just this. If I could just twist myself into a pretzel enough and just love this person and say all the right things and do all the right things enough, I know they can get through their trauma when like the person's not even that fucking invested in like working on them shit themselves, right? They're just like, everyone else is the problem but me. I'm fine, I'm perfect, and this person's just like dripping in dysfunctional, shit in their life. Their life is just kind of a shit show, and they just really have no interest in changing. Ooh, yeah, it's not a fun place to be, and that's where a lot of the toxic relationship dynamic can come in, right? You're in a relationship with this difficult person who doesn't want to change, or maybe they do want to change, but they're not really actually putting in any kind of work to change. And you're like, if I could just be perfect, and then of course, because we're all fallible human beings, when we fail to be perfect, we're just riddled with this, especially when the relationship falls apart and the relationship ends, right? You're just like, if I just could have twisted myself into a pretzel better, I know I could have saved them. Oh man, if you've ever been in a relationship and had it end, and you're like, if I could have just been perfect, I would have saved them. Like, that is a key defining symptom of codependency. If you, how do I put this into words? If you set the bar of expectation for your behavior so high that you have to be perfect in the relationship, but you set the bar for them so low that they're just constantly dysfunctional, constantly treating you like crap, constantly disrespecting your boundary, that gap, that is a defining trait of codependency.
The guilt can also be triggered in future relationships that in which the person they're in a relationship with is struggling with something. And if the person with codependency can't fix it, they feel immensely guilty. Now, they may also have been blamed in the past. If you hadn't done this, then I wouldn't, blah. So one of the behaviors that is often seen in dysfunctional others, and I use that term because it's not just people with addictions. It can be people with trauma histories or borderline personality or a whole host of things. So we're just going to say dysfunctional other, someone who is having difficulty dealing with life on life's terms.
Yeah.
But a lot of times, the dysfunctional other in these relationships may, instead of taking responsibility for their actions, they will blame the person with codependency. And the person with codependency may accept that blame and feel guilty for it. And then enabling or rescuing behavior. And when we enable somebody, we are keeping them from
And before we go on from the enabling thing, I want to make another comment on what you just said. Oftentimes, people with codependency issues are highly empathetic people. They're, empaths, if we call them. Highly compassionate people, highly sensitive people, whatever you want to call the term. Quite often, these people are what's called internalizers. When something bad happens, they tend to blame themselves. They tend to be overly taking of accountability. Like she just mentioned, what tends to unfortunately happen is they tend to end up with relationships with people that are just the opposite, that are highly externalizing individuals. They have a very hard time taking accountability for how they show up in relationships and in life in general. So if they got fired because they showed up every fucking day to work like 20 minutes late, oh, it's not my fault, it's the boss's fault. My boss was a hard ass, If their relationship falls apart, oh, well, they were a narcissist. Oh, well, they were a jerk. Oh, well, they should have tried harder. So quite often we see in codependent relationships this pairing between the codependencer being the extreme internalizer where everything is their fault and they just need to be perfect and then they can save the other person. Quite often they get with, what did she call them, dysfunctional other? I'm going to call them a jackass who just has no ability to take accountability for their own behavior, makes people's lives a living hell, and you can typically tell who these people are because they typically just have a wreckage path of like broken relationships and issues holding down a job and just instability all over the place. And sometimes it can be because of an actual mental health disorder like borderline personality disorder, narcissism, like she said, trauma. But yeah, quite often these people just have a really hard time taking accountability and, like she said, can push the blame onto this other person, whether consciously or subconsciously, because they know this person just has a natural habit of taking too goddamn much accountability. So getting to a healthier point of being like, if you struggle with this in relationships, getting to a healthier point, and I know I've had to work through this in my own therapy work, of every relationship has 50% accountability on both sides. I am responsible for 50% of every problem in a relationship. My partner's responsible for 50% of the problems in the relationship. If you're ever in a relationship where that's not constantly being discussed and acknowledged, one, you're probably in a toxic relationship, but two, you could quite also be in a codependent relationship, Because if one person's like, I take 0 accountability, and the other person's like, I take 100, that's also a defining symptom of codependency. And quite often, the person who takes 100% accountability are enabling this bullshit behavior from the other person. And they are also not only enable them, but then also frequently filled with guilt as a result of it, which is crazy when they're just taking 2 goddamn accountability, if anything.
Experiencing the consequences of their own behaviors. If Johnny gets into trouble and gets arrested, enabling behavior may be bailing them out and making sure you get an attorney that can fix it for them. That doesn't cause them to learn from their consequences, the natural consequences of things. So now the question is, once you realize what your symptoms are, what do you do about them? I would encourage you this week
in the next video we'll watch
the symptoms that we just talked about.
Be about healing from codependency.
Explore ways that you might demonstrate that. How might you express or act hypervigilant? How might you demonstrate the need to control others, etc.? Determine if the way you act or react to things is excessive or a problem. Every once in a while, it's important to control some things. Everything's on a spectrum. Are you doing it in a way that is healthy and helpful, or are you doing it to an extreme? Identify the function the behavior serves. How does the behavior help you feel safer, help you feel loved, help you feel like you have power in your life? Identify how you learned that behavior. Did you learn it from watching caregivers? Did you learn it by trial and error in relationships? How did you learn it? So you're exploring some of those traumas that taught you that you were unsafe. And then start thinking about alternate responses. You've developed
Sorry, y'all. Closed caption.
other ways of responding.
Oh, and I'm blocking the thing too. Hold on.
Know of other
Those
ways
of you who are
of
actually
responding.
interested in this, I'll move myself a little bit here.
Start thinking about what your options are. This is not, an overnight process. Right now, what I'm asking you to do is to just start exploring your history and exploring your behaviors or your symptoms, if you will, so you can identify their function and then later identify behaviors that are healthier that will serve that same purpose.
So I want to back up. How was that video? Was that... I won't ask anyone. I won't ask anyone in the chat to say whether or not they feel like they relate to symptoms of codependency, because it's a very vulnerable share. But thank you, Radotez. I'm glad the information. And again, I love all the kudos go to Dr. Snipes. I love her channel. I personally watch her videos all the time. I think she just does such a great job of introducing a topic and then really breaking down like the signs and symptoms and also action steps on what you can do. But yeah, I know, at least for me in particular, codependency has been the thing that I've had to really work to overcome for many years in my life. And looking back, I'm like, oh wow, I can really see how that defined a lot of my relationship dynamics in the past. I've actually seen a male therapist that specializes in codependency recovery. So, yeah, there's entire therapists that specialize in this kind of thing. I've really thought about when I get through grad school and get my licensure, I honestly really think that might be a niche that I go into, because it's such a, man, it can be devastating to people's ability to have healthy relationships so much. So anyway, hopefully that was helpful. Let's see, I've got one more video about ways to heal from codependency. I love introducing different mental health topics on this stream, but I don't ever want to like leave someone with like just introducing the topic and then be like, you're fucked, because I think that's not a helpful space. So the next video that I'm going to introduce is by an actual therapist. She's a marriage and family therapist on YouTube. She's huge on YouTube. If y'all know me, you probably know her because she's far bigger than I am, or probably will ever be. But Katie Morton, she's been around for a long time. Oh my God, I've probably been following Katie Morton and her YouTube journey for like 10 years. I think the first time I watched her videos was when I was over in Japan, living in Japan like 10 years ago. She's amazing. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist, which was the grad school program that I was in. So yay, MFT school. And yeah, so we'll watch a quick little video on that, and then I'm probably going to hop up and take a little breaky break after that. But so if you think that from the last video we watched you might be codependent, here are some helpful tips. I'm going to move myself back down here to position on how you might be able to begin to recover from it. And I will say, like Dr. Snipe said, healing from any kind of long-standing mental health disorder, whether we're talking about insecure attachment, codependency issues, personality disorders, depression, anxiety, it's not a overnight fix. And it's not quite often a linear path either. So hopefully, for those of you who are watching out there, if this stuff resonates for you, it can help you begin the journey of learning more, possibly reaching out to some kind of qualified mental health professional to work through your stuff. And you can get started with stuff, because just watching a couple videos isn't going to be enough. Anyway, let's dive into the videos here.
When we struggle with codependency, or we were raised in a household where this was happening, it can be hard for us to get out of this pattern of behavior, which is why today we are going to talk about the 7 ways we can heal from codependency. Codependency is when we are in an unbalanced relationship. One person's behavior helps support another person's self-destructive behavior. Usually people talk about this as a...
And I want to say, man, she's so good at like just putting things into the exact perfect words. I love Katie Morton. Oh man, one of these days I'm gonna have to go out to, I think it's VidCon is the YouTube convention. And she's been to VidCon like a million times all the time. I would love to meet her in person. Man, she's so awesome. Oh God, what the hell was I gonna say now? Over here gushing. Oh, unbalanced relationships. The saving the person from self-destruction. Like Dr. Snipe said, that's often where the enabling stuff comes into play. Often, you'll get in a relationship with someone who has self-destructive patterns, for whatever reason. Maybe